The game is pretty optimal, which means the software is doing what we want without wasteful cycles on bad processes. Every PC gamer must accept the reality of the relationship between their hardware and what the software they are running is doing. There are a few real issues, but they are affecting a very, very small percentage of users. We are fixing those, and many are already fixed. But please accept that the game is doing a lot and running pretty optimally, and that you may have to either accept some trade-offs between FPS features and resolution as your preference, or you will continue to be disappointed. Use DLSS. It's great. The game was built to take advantage of it. This is not a competitive FPS, and I have been led to believe that in a blind test that humans cannot detect any input lag. In my own demonstrates and experiments, I believe this is true. If you are so attached to the idea that DLSS is bad for your game experience because of something you saw or read on the internet, I'm sorry. I hope instead you would use the technology designed to give you the experience you want. This is really interesting. This is the CEO of Gearbox, who just put out Borderlands 4, which is being accused heavily in Steam reviews by lots of people testing out the game of being pretty unoptimized. Now, he is claiming that it is pretty optimized, that there are very few actual problems. You just need to accept the performance of your hardware, and that really the game was built to take advantage of DLSS. So, this seems to be the closest a developer has ever been that I've seen of effectively just saying, yeah, you really need to use DLSS to get any reasonable performance in the game. Just deal with it. That's how it was designed. His words, that was how it was built. So, okay, interesting. Now, I want to actually explore this because, I mean, it is true that in a big new game, that you might expect older hardware to not perform well. But at the same time, I believe that the proper use case of technologies like DLSS are more of like, you should be able to get decent performance at native rendering resolution and then get a performance boost from DLSS and then turn on frame generation only once your frame rate is already quite high. So that you don't feel the input lag issues. If we try to confuse frame generation with performance, you run into the issue of if you're coming from a low base frame rate, things don't look good. It doesn't feel good. So let's talk about that. Also, even DLSS upscaling. And by the way, I'm overall very positive about DLSS. I just think it shouldn't be used in place of optimization. Even DLSS upscaling can have image quality issues, which we can talk about. So I think there's still a place for actual optimization beyond just using DLSS plus frame generation to get over 60 FPS and pretending everything's fine and the game is running optimally. Now, what I'm going to do to investigate the situation is actually let's take a look at how this game runs on a pretty typical gaming PC. The most popular graphics card on Steam right now is an RTX 4060, and this is not old hardware. This hardware was brand new, just released barely 2 years ago. The successor to it has only been out for just a couple of months, so anybody buying a mainstream gaming PC or laptop for that matter, because the third most popular GPU on Steam is the 4060 laptop GPU, which actually performs very similar to its desktop counterpart, unlike a lot of laptop versus desktop GPU combos. So if you bought a gaming desktop or laptop anytime in the last 2 years, there's a very good chance it had an RTX 4060 in it. The second most popular GPU on Steam is actually less powerful than this with the RTX 3060, and then the fourth and fifth place GPUs are also less powerful than this. So the majority of, odds are somebody buying a recent gaming PC and a typical Steam user has something like a 4060 or worse. And also, we have, I'm going to put this in a system with the Ryzen 5 5600X, which is above the minimum system requirements for this game, and is, I would say, a pretty typical mainstream gaming CPU. So with that said, let's go ahead and actually jump into the game. So I just built the 4060 5600X based system with 32 gigabytes of RAM. So we're between the minimum and recommended specs for this game. And we're going to go ahead and take a look at some things. First of all, Randy seems pretty big on people not overdoing the resolution. So how about we just play at 1080p resolution? And you know what? Let's start at native resolution. but we are going to use DLSS as well. I'll also talk about frame generation. And let's go ahead and, okay, we will start out at maximum settings, but don't worry, I will also turn down graphic settings, because my point here is I want to just take this at face value and just actually examine the situation. Are people just running the game at too high of graphic settings and refusing to use technologies available to them? Or is the game actually super unoptimized? Or is it somewhere in between? Let's go ahead and take a look. So let's start up a game save that is just near the beginning of the game. And while it's already done a shader compilation burn at the start, looks like we're compiling shaders again as we load into a new area. So the game does try to compile shaders. But this has been one aspect of the game that I do feel is unoptimized, is the shader compilation. Because your beginning experience with the game, for the first couple hours at least, is full of stutters the first time you do almost anything. Now, right now, my overall frame rate is so low, we might not see the shader compilation spikes as badly, just because you can't spike to worse than what we're already getting. Because we're currently at 22 frames per second. Also, notice that I am monitoring the latency. You can see it right here, because if we talk about the responsiveness, the input lag, especially as we get into frame generation and all that, that's going to be an important metric for us to have available as well. Okay, so here we are GPU limited on the 4060 at max settings, into the 20s. It is completely unplayable. So let's go ahead and just already kick on some upscaling. So, okay, like I said, we were already only at 1080p, and we're already on fairly new mainstream hardware. But like I said, let's go ahead and kick on upscaling. So let's go to DLSS quality. So this is going to improve performance. This is not frame generation. It actually makes the game render quicker, run faster. Notice it looks like standing still, at least, our frame rate is now around 40. But here's where I want to be clear that DLSS is not perfect, and there's a place for native rendering resolution. Do you see the weird ghosting edges on this targeting reticle? This is a major graphical glitch that I find incredibly distracting, okay? Now, I want to be clear. That only exists when using DLSS. If I turn DLSS off, that's going to go away, okay? So we're turning DLSS off, and frame rates are awful, but there's no longer that weird trailing stuff around the targeting reticle. So it is incredibly important to note that native rendering resolution still has advantages over things like DLSS. Now, I like DLSS, and I generally recommend using DLSS in almost every game that has it available, even on high-end hardware, because I generally think it is worth using over not using it. But to pretend like it doesn't have any negatives at all, and the baseline performance of the game should be based on using it, I think that is just incorrect. Or to pretend like the game has DLSS just perfectly implemented and there's no problems. I'm sorry, but this is incredibly distracting. If I aim down this gun and see these weird trailing artifacts, I find that incredibly distracting. This is not what I would consider an optimal experience. Now, also, the frame rate is just horrible right now as well, and if we start moving, it gets worse. We're barely over 30. But hey, we haven't kicked on frame generation yet. So let's go ahead and solve all of our problems with frame generation. Woo, massive frame time spikes there. I think that was one of the shader compilation stutters. Anyway, 1% lows went down to 2. Anyway, the average frame rates are in the middle, 1% lows are on the right, current frame rates on the left. But our latency is on the bottom there, on the bottom left, and we're seeing around a little under 60 milliseconds of latency. And again, we're only in kind of the 30-something frames per second range, upper 30s, so it doesn't feel super responsive on a mouse. Now, maybe people playing on controllers are fine with this kind of responsiveness. Doesn't feel real great on a PC mouse, in my opinion. Now, if we kick on frame generation, let's go ahead and see if all of our problems have been solved. So, kind of ignore the frame time graph at this point. The frame generation 1% lows don't report properly to this monitoring software. But okay, let's see. So our latency, now that it's settling in, is now over 70 milliseconds of latency. It varies depending on what exactly we're doing. Let's go ahead and run around here. Oh, it spiked over 100 milliseconds there for a second. Let's get into some combat. We're over 90. Oh, wow, massive frame time spikes. But guys, we're averaging around 60 frames per second. So when you see things like their optimization guides that say that, if you just kick on frame generation, you'll be getting around 60 frames per second, I can tell you right now that I am having a terrible experience. My mouse feels really floaty. I'm seeing weird trailing artifacts around my targeting reticle. And the latency is over 80 milliseconds much of the time, spiked over 100 milliseconds there for a second. Probably having VRAM related issues too, because we're on an 8 gigabyte card. But anyway, so we're having all sorts of problems. But if you just are saying, I'm getting 60 frames per second, this is great, this is the problem. Using frame generation to go from a bad frame rate to a what's normally thought of as a good frame rate is not a good experience. It might be better than not using it at all, because it does have some motion fluidity, but it certainly makes responsiveness worse. And just overall, I don't think that this is a great experience, okay? So let's go ahead and turn frame gen back off for a second, and I wanna now talk about the actual performance numbers we're getting here on this hardware. So notice that we're in kind of the mid to low 30 FPS range. Sometimes we get weird, CPU spikes, but mostly GPU limited at this point. Now I would like to show you something else, because when talking about a game, whether a game is, optimally coded, it's really hard for me, who doesn't have access to the game code, nor am I actually a game developer, to have a lot of insight in that. But I do at least have comparisons to other games I've experienced. Now, it's really important when you're comparing one game to another and talking about optimization, to compare the right kind of game at least, because open world games are way harder to run than, more closed environment experiences. So I was trying to think of what is a graphically demanding open world first person shooter style game. And I thought of Cyberpunk 2077. And so I just ran this benchmark on the 4060 right before we started filming this video. And I'd like us to notice something here. Let me start it over. So I would like you to look at two things. One is the frame rate, and the other is the graphics. I think these graphics look phenomenal because this is path-traced Cyberpunk 2077. This is 1080p output using DLSS quality, so the same resolution settings and upscaling settings that we were just using in Borderlands 4. And I think that this looks absolutely stunning. But I don't think that it is, running amazingly well. However, I would say that this is justifying the results that we are seeing on it, okay? That's what I think. I think it justifies the performance cost because the path tracing is stunning. The game looks extremely realistic. There's, pin sharp reflections on everything, and looks like we're averaging about 38 frames per second. Let's go ahead and jump back into Borderlands 4 at its maximum graphics preset. So we're comparing maximum graphics to maximum graphics. I'm going to reset the frame rate averages, and we're getting very similar performance, perhaps a little bit lower, but again, it's not an identical scene in either game anyway, but I think we could say that the performance level is at least comparable. Now, I don't think either game looks completely perfect, but I would say that at least to my eye, Cyberpunk in path tracing mode looks more visually impressive than what we're seeing here from Borderlands 4 at its maximum graphics preset, and they are achieving around the same performance level. Okay? Now, let me get that guy out of the way. Now, the other thing we can look at is what about turning down graphic settings? So I'm going to go ahead and switch down to low graphic settings. We'll go back to native resolution for a second, but still only 1080p. We're going down to low graphic settings because this is something that, again, Randy did seem to be, and I'll restart the game. So While I'm restarting the game, because that is best practice when changing the graphic settings, I want to look at a couple of things. One is Cyberpunk again. So this is Cyberpunk running at medium settings, native 1080p resolution. So Cyberpunk, medium settings, native 1080p resolution, no upscaling involved here. And this is running at around 100 frames per second. We're triple digits. Again, this is on the RTX 4060. And I would say that stuff like this bar scene are still stunning. Like, honestly, the game at medium settings scales down extremely well. So performance goes through the roof. You don't get your, full-on path tracing visuals or anything like that. Like when we see this puddle here, you're not going to get the pin-sharp ray traced reflections that we got in the path tracing mode. But overall, the general look of the game has scaled down gracefully. And we're running it at native 1080p resolution, which is still going to look pretty good on a 1080p display. And so that is if we scale down the graphic settings, because again, I'm not a game developer looking at the actual code for Borderlands 4, but for me as a reviewer of hardware and performance, I like to see a game be able to scale gracefully. So at its maximum settings, it looks amazing, and yeah, maybe it's incredibly demanding, but I would say that at its reduced graphic settings, it should scale down gracefully and have a lot of performance headroom. So now I have in the background restarted Borderlands 4 onto its low graphic settings at native 1080p, meaning this is as low as it goes without relying on resolution scaling. We're at 1080p, low settings, upscaling currently disabled. We're just on low, okay? Now, do you notice that all of the beautiful foliage that we had on the maximum settings is just gone? Okay, but do you also notice that performance is still below 60 frames per second on a mainstream graphics card that just came out 2 years ago and just barely had a successor? By the way, still getting shader compilation stutter there. That went down to 4 frames per second. By the way, we're mostly GPU limited right now, although you can see occasionally the GPU usage drops a bit when we get a CPU-related spike, and our CPU is absolutely pushed to the wall right now, performance-wise as well. And again, fairly mainstream CPU. So this game is demanding on both the GPU and the CPU. And now another thing I want to watch for is again, the graphics are not looking good scaled down like this. Look in the distance as we move forward. We're going to see lots of pop in on stuff, like details kind of pop in as we go. Let's go back this way for a second. So kind of look at this hill. Let's see what happens. Let's see stuff pops in very obviously as we get closer. The textures certainly don't look amazing. And again, despite all of this, despite the fact that in many ways this looks quite bad, I mean, the lighting I think still looks pretty good. And I think that's where a lot of the performance demand is coming from in this game, is from its lighting system. And so the lighting I think still looks pretty good, but the reflections here look pretty bad. You see all these screen space artifacts and all of that. So not very good reflections. I mean, look how these lights are interacting with the screen space reflections on the water. This looks, in many ways, quite terrible. I mean, if we want to look at the shadow situation, so as we walk forward, let's see what happens with shadows. So you can see that this windmill right here has static shadows, even though the object is moving, it just has static shadows behind it. We can walk forward. We can see pop-in happening. Again, there's all the foliage and ground detail is gone. Here we can see eventually, do we start getting to, okay, right here, we have to get this close before we start seeing the dynamic shadows. But interestingly, the static shadows are still there on that windmill. So this is looking quite bad in a lot of ways. Again, the lighting still does look kind of nice. And I guess the overall still comic book style of the game is still maintaining to be intact. And again, overall performance numbers have been averaging 57 frames per second as we've been running around looking at all of this stuff. We're not even really in any sort of combat. So once again, I'd like us to switch back over and take a look at another big open world first-person shooters. It's not the looter shooter genre. Again, it's hard to get comparison points on these, but Cyberpunk 2077 at its medium graphic settings, running at 100 frames per second on this same hardware. Again, it's a little hard to justify what we're seeing. In fact, remember how in Borderlands 4 right now, we're getting around 60-ish frames per second, okay? So one thing that might be interesting to look at is, so what could Cyberpunk look like running at around 60 frames per second? If we want to look at that as kind of a comparison point. Well, this is the one notch down from maximum preset. So this is RT Ultra. So it's not RT Overdrive, so it's not path tracing, but it's the otherwise maxed out ray tracing mode. Now I am here using DLSS quality. So this is using DLSS quality rather than using native resolution. But notice the frame rates are matching up here. And again, looks really good. We've got a lot of ray traced bounce lighting. We've got ray traced shadows. We have ray traced reflections. As it comes around this bend and you look at this shadow, you're not going to get ugly screen space reflections. You get nice, sharp ray traced reflections. And again, performance numbers are now up over 60 FPS average through this run. Again, it's a big open environment. You can see the shadows in the distance staying pretty consistent. They're ray traced. Not everything is completely perfect, but it looks pretty dang good. And it's running around 60 frames per second in a big open world environment on this same hardware. And again, we can switch back here. And I will say, though, that here I am using native rendering resolution and not using DLSS quality, which I was doing on the Cyberpunk results. So actually, how about we go ahead and kick on DLSS quality, see what our performance looks like here. And this does help out significantly. So we're now getting, in the 70-something FPS range, although we're starting to get CPU limited. So that's one of the issues that we run into in Borderlands 4 as well that I don't think enough people are talking about, is it's very CPU demanding as well. It's not just the GPUs. GPUs are easier to test, but this game is very demanding on the CPUs as well. But it does look like if we want to continue this kind of back and forth between Cyberpunk and Borderlands 4, we could push graphic settings a bit higher if we're using the internal, DLSS quality rendering resolution, despite the fact that, again, that's really bugging me on my targeting reticle right now. Anyway, this reminds me of FrameGen artifacts, but this is not using FrameGen right now. Ugh. Anyway, let's go ahead and turn up the graphic settings a little bit. Maybe we could try out the high settings. Let's try it first with a game restart. So I will get a game restart. While we restart the game, I'm going to go ahead and do that in the background while we, again, make sure we're taking a look at what we are responding to here, right? So what are we responding to? So again, the claim here is that this is optimal. So what does it mean by optimal? The software is doing what we want without wasteful cycles on bad processes. So, I think, from a technical definition, when we're talking about programming games and stuff, that is the idea of optimal. Optimization is you don't have wasteful programming that's doing stuff that doesn't need to be done. But I really think it's overlooking the basic game design aspect of optimization. That optimization should probably be a part of the base game design targets. When you design the art system, when you choose the engine, when you decide how to use the engine and which major engine features that you're trying to implement, all of that, that's all part of the design process. And it looks to me here like their thought was, let's just kick on all of the big Unreal Engine features. We're going to heavily rely on Lumen. I'm assuming Nanite's going to from a performance perspective here. And I feel like that's leading to some pretty poor performance that also does not scale down gracefully. But again, it's hard for me to determine specifically what they could have done differently in the code. But again, we can just sort of look at what sort of performance are we getting. So I have loaded back into the game after a restart. So this is now on the, let me show the graphic settings. So we are now on the high preset using DLSS quality. High is the middle preset. There's, so the very high would have actually been the one notch down from the maximum. But this is DLSS quality. And again, we are getting around 60 frames per second. So again, this is similar performance matching to what Cyberpunk was doing at its RT Ultra settings at the same resolution and DLSS values. And again, I'm just not really seeing how Cyberpunk can run somewhat photorealistic RT Ultra mode at this same kind of performance tier as we're getting this. I do think this looks nice. And so I guess it's the cost of Lumen. Like it really must be. Lumen is just really heavy. And so I'm also wondering that, given this, that they're going for this comic book art style, or like a hand-painted sort of art style, I wonder, I don't have the technical ability to assess it myself, if somehow there's more geometric detail or something going on here that isn't optimal. So again, Randy Pitchford is claiming that their code is pretty optimal already, but I just can't help but feel like you could achieve this sort of a look without this sort of performance cost. It just really seems unnecessary. Also, just other design choices also just don't really seem optimal to me. Like I said, things like, I don't think I've pointed this out yet, but have you noticed how at first I thought grass sort of popped in as you got close, but I don't think it actually does. I think it's as you get close, it starts movement, and further away, it's not moving. But that means that when you walk forward through the grass, you get these weird, like poppy sort of look as it gets close to the camera. But I think it's really that it just starts animating closer to the camera, which I find distracting because the grass is already there, but it kind of gives you that pop-in sort of look. So I can nitpick minor details where, again, I don't feel like what they're doing here is completely optimal. And again, can we get this kind of comic book style to the grass? Because when you actually look at it at a distance, because of the sort of outlines that they're doing on everything, it ends up crushing a lot of the detail that's there. But when you do look at it super closely, there does appear to actually be a lot of detail. So are they rendering a lot more than they need to achieve this basic style? So I feel like maybe where they went wrong was if you're setting out to achieve a certain look, can you achieve that look in a more optimal way without having to use a lot of the whatever it is that is drawing so much performance here? So anyway, I'm curious what you guys think, because I do think it's fair to say that a game is running, this game is running very demanding stuff. Unreal Engine 5 is demanding. Lumen is demanding. And honestly, the lighting in Borderlands 4 looks good. And the game overall can look really good. I don't think it scales down well. And I do think it performs below typical expectations for PC. And we have seen other, big open world games achieve what I would argue are better looks, at the same frame rate or higher frame rates. Again, possibly with better looks. Again, they're not trying to achieve exactly the same art style, so it's hard to compare. And I'm even going up to ray tracing type feature set here. Anyway, so I would argue that it's not optimal, but the CEO of Gearbox seems to disagree. Seems to feel like just using DLSS solves all of the problems. That's how the game was built. And that frame generation doesn't have any sort of downside, apparently. Nobody can actually tell if you're not being misled by things that you saw or read on the internet. So, again, like I said, I am positive about DLSS. I think it's good, but it is not perfect. You do get image quality artifacts that are sometimes quite distracting, like we're seeing right here. Frame generation does increase input lag, and coming from a low frame rate does not suddenly make the game super performant. You get higher frame rate numbers and the game does look overall smoother, but you need a high enough base frame rate before kicking it on for it to work well. Like right now, when we're at around 60 frames per second, this is not a terrible base frame rate from which to use frame generation. And I think a lot of people will prefer to use frame generation here to not using frame generation here. Look, it gets my motion fluidity up to around 100 frames per second. So yeah, like I can absolutely achieve a reasonable experience in this game on this hardware, but that doesn't mean I think it's optimal. And I don't think that game developers targeting their performance from the get-go to already be using DLSS and frame generation to achieve a reasonable experience is the way things should be. Ideally, you get decent performance, at least at native 1080p, and from there, you can increase performance using things like DLSS upscaling to get a super high frame rate and then kick on frame gen to take advantage of a high refresh rate display. But you need that base level of performance to be there. And again, like if I kick off DLSS right now, this is native 1080p high on the most popular GPU on Steam. Just asking for 1080p, and high is the, I want to be clear here, high is the middle graphics preset. The middle graphics preset. And we're kind of in the mid-30s right now. So let me know what you guys think about all of this. I know I've done a lot of Borderlands 4 content, but I read this and I just had to say something. Again, let me know what you guys think. I hope all of you have an excellent day.